Settle in. But before we get started, give this video a like and subscribe if this kind of deep dive storytelling is your thing. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Night falls early in the Bavarian countryside, the last rays of sun slipping behind dense stands of spruce and pine. Here, in the spring of 1922, the land is still raw with the memory of war. Fields pocked by shell craters, men's faces marked by loss. But in the woods north of Munich, beyond the village of Grobern, another kind of darkness lingers. It is the darkness of Hinterkaifeck, a farmstead so remote that even the locals speak its name with a hush, as though the very syllables might summon something best left undisturbed. The farm sits at the end of a rutted track, a half-hour's walk from the nearest neighbor. Its outbuildings, barn, stable, and toolshed lean against the wind, battered by years of hard weather. The main house, squat and whitewashed, seems to huddle in on itself, its shuttered windows like wary eyes. Smoke curls from the chimney, a thin gray thread against the twilight, but the place feels empty, as if it is holding its breath. Inside, the Gruber family moves through their routines with a kind of wary caution. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, is a man shaped by the land, stooped, broad-shouldered, his hands thick with callus. His wife, Casilia, is quieter, her face lined by years of toil and disappointment. Their daughter, Victoria Gabriel, returned home after tragedy, a widow with 2 children of her own, 7-year-old Casilia, bright and restless, and Joseph, a toddler whose paternity is the subject of whispered speculation. They are joined, on this particular evening, by a newcomer, Maria Baumgartner, a maid hired after the last one fled in fear. The isolation of Hinterkaifeck is both a shield and a curse. It protects the family from the prying eyes of townsfolk, from the gossip that has dogged them for years. But it also leaves them vulnerable. The woods press close, the silence broken only by the wind and the distant bark of a dog. At night, the house creaks and settles, and the shadows seem to shift of their own accord. There is a heaviness in the air, a sense that something unseen is watching, waiting. In the weeks leading up to this night, Andreas has noticed things he cannot explain. Footprints in the snow, leading from the forest to the house, but never away. He's gone missing, doors left ajar. At first, he dismissed these as the forgetfulness of age, the tricks of an old mind. But then there were the noises, footsteps overhead, the soft scrape of something moving in the attic when the family was gathered below. He searched, of course, climbed the narrow stairs to the dusty loft, lantern in hand, but found nothing. Still, the feeling persisted, a prickling at the back of the neck, the certainty that they were not alone. The previous maid, a local girl, had lasted only a few months. She complained of cold drafts and strange sounds, of waking in the night to find her blankets pulled away. She told Victoria she felt eyes on her, even when she was alone. One morning, she packed her things and left without a word, refusing even to collect her wages. "That house is cursed," she told her mother. "Something evil lives there." Andreas scoffed at such talk. He was not a man given to superstition, but even he could not deny the unease that had settled over Hinterkaifeck. He tried to reassure his family, to keep their routines steady, milking the cows at dawn, mending fences, chopping wood. But the tension was palpable. Victoria, once lively and outspoken, had grown withdrawn. She spent hours at the piano, her fingers tracing the keys in melancholy chords. Little Casilia clung to her mother's skirts, her laughter subdued. Only Joseph seemed untouched, babbling in his crib, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling around him. The farm itself bore the marks of neglect. The fields, once carefully tended, were choked with weeds. The barn roof sagged, its shingles missing in places. Tools rusted in the shed, forgotten. It was as if the land itself had turned against them, mirroring the decay within the family. Yet they endured, bound by necessity and habit. There was nowhere else to go. As dusk deepened, the family gathered for supper. A simple meal of bread and cheese, a pot of soup steaming on the stove. The new maid, Maria, sat quietly at the end of the table, her hands folded in her lap. She was grateful for the work, but she could not shake the feeling that she had stepped into a place set apart from the world, a place where the ordinary rules no longer applied. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled, a long, mournful sound that seemed to echo through the trees. Andreas rose to check the doors, making sure each was bolted tight. He paused at the threshold, peering into the darkness. For a moment, he thought he saw a movement at the edge of the yard, a flicker of pale light, a shadow slipping between the trees. He blinked, and it was gone. He told himself it was nothing, just his imagination playing tricks. But as he turned back to the warmth of the kitchen, he could not shake the feeling that something was drawing closer, inch by inch, hidden by the night. In the days to come, the events at Hinterkaifeck would become legend, a story whispered in taverns and around kitchen tables, a cautionary tale of isolation and dread. But on this night, the Gruber family knew only the weight of their own unease, the sense that the world had narrowed to the flickering circle of lamplight, and that beyond it, in the darkness, something waited. The winter of 1922 in Bavaria was particularly harsh. Snow fell in thick, silent drifts, blanketing the countryside in an unbroken white that muffled every sound and erased every path. For those who lived in the scattered farmsteads outside Groburn, the snow was both a blessing and a curse. It insulated their homes from the bitter wind, but it also isolated them, cutting off roads and making every journey a trial. At Hinterkaifeck, the snow seemed to press in on all sides, turning the farmstead into an island adrift in a frozen sea. It was on a morning in late March, as the last of winter's grip reluctantly loosened, that Andreas Gruber first noticed the footprints. He was an early riser, accustomed to greeting the day before the sun had fully crested the horizon. That morning, as he stepped out to tend to the animals, his boots crunched through a thin crust of ice. The air was sharp, filled with the faint scent of wood smoke and frost. He paused, as he always did, to scan the yard, a habit born of years living at the edge of the wild. What he saw made him stop short. There, in the pristine snow between the edge of the woods and the house, was a single line of footprints. They were deep and deliberate, spaced evenly, as if made by someone walking with purpose. The tracks led straight from the forest to the back door of the house. Andreas followed them with his eyes, his brow furrowing. He looked for a return path, for any sign that the visitor had left the way they came. There was nothing. The footprints ended at the threshold and did not reappear. He knelt to examine the prints more closely. They were larger than his own, the tread unfamiliar. He tried to recall if any of the neighbors had come by the previous evening, but he could remember no such visit. The snow had fallen late, after dark, and he had been the last to lock the doors. He straightened, a chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Someone had come to Hinterkaifeck in the night, and, as far as the snow revealed, they had never left. Inside, the house was still and silent. The others were just beginning to stir. Andreas said nothing at first, unwilling to alarm his family. He told himself it was nothing, a vagrant, perhaps, or a hunter lost in the woods. But as he went about his chores, the image of those footprints lingered in his mind. He found himself glancing over his shoulder, listening for sounds that didn't belong. Later that day, he mentioned the footprints to Victoria. She listened, her face pale, her eyes wide. "Are you sure, Papa?" she whispered. Maybe it was just an animal. But Andreas shook his head. He knew the difference between the tracks of a fox or a stray dog and the purposeful stride of a man. "No," he said quietly. "Someone was here." As the days passed, the memory of the footprints grew heavier. Each morning, Andreas checked the snow, hoping to find new tracks, evidence that the visitor had left, or at least moved on. But the snow remained undisturbed, except for the paths made by the family themselves. The prints at the back door faded, softened by wind and sun, but their impression lingered in his mind. Then, other things began to go missing. A set of keys vanished from their hook in the kitchen. Doors that had been locked at night were found ajar in the morning. The family began to hear noises, soft, shuffling sounds in the attic, the creak of floorboards overhead. At first, they tried to explain these away. The house was old, after all, and the winter wind could make it groan and shift. But the noises persisted, growing louder, more insistent. The previous maid had complained of such things, but Andreas had dismissed her fears as foolishness. Now, he was not so sure. He searched the house from top to bottom, climbing into the cramped attic with a lantern, peering into every shadowed corner. He found nothing, no sign of an intruder, no evidence of a hidden guest. Yet the feeling of being watched, of being studied from the darkness, would not leave him. Victoria grew anxious, her nerves fraying with each passing day. She kept the children close, refusing to let them play outside alone. At night, she double-checked the locks, her hands trembling. Even Casilia, the elder child, seemed subdued, her usual chatter replaced by wary glances at the windows. The neighbors, when they heard the story, shrugged it off. "It's just the winter playing tricks," they said. "You're imagining things, Andreas." But the old man knew better. The footprints had been real, solid, undeniable evidence that someone had come to Hinterkaifeck in the dead of night. Someone who had not left. The snow, once a symbol of purity and peace, now felt like a shroud. It covered the land, muffling every sound, hiding every secret. But it could not hide the truth that the Gruber family was not alone. That somewhere, in the woods or perhaps even within the walls of their own home, a stranger watched and waited. As March drew to a close, the sense of unease deepened. The family moved through their days in a state of quiet dread, each moment shadowed by the knowledge that their sanctuary had been breached. The footprints in the snow were gone, erased by time and weather. But their message remained, as clear as if it had been carved in stone. Someone had come to Hinterkaifeck, and they had not left. The days at Hinterkaifeck grew shorter as March faded into April, the sun lingering only briefly before retreating behind the tangled silhouettes of the forest. The Gruber family's routines, already shaped by caution, became increasingly shadowed by a sense of intrusion, as if the very air in the house was thickening with dread. What began as a single set of footprints in the snow soon spiraled into a series of small, inexplicable violations, the disappearance of keys, the subtle shifting of objects, and, most disturbing of all, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the attic overhead. It began with the keys. At first, Andreas Gruber thought little of it. Keys were always being misplaced on a form, dropped in the hayloft, left in a coat pocket, or simply forgotten on a windowsill. But these were not the ordinary keys to the barn or the tool shed. These were the heavy iron keys to the house itself, the ones that hung on a nail by the kitchen door, always in the same place, always within Andreas's line of sight. He was a man who prided himself on order, and the loss of the keys gnawed him. One morning, as he prepared to fetch water from the well, Andreas reached for the familiar ring and found it missing. He searched the kitchen, then the hallway, then the pockets of his work trousers. Nothing. He asked Casilia, who shook her head. Victoria, too, denied having seen them. The children were too small to reach the nail, and Maria, the new maid, had only just arrived. The keys were simply gone. That evening, Andreas searched the house from top to bottom. He checked every drawer, every shelf, every nook where a key might have slipped unnoticed. He even lifted the loose floorboard in the pantry, where he sometimes hid small valuables. But the keys had vanished. He tried to dismiss it as forgetfulness, but the unease lingered. The next day, another key went missing, this time, the one to the cellar. Andreas was certain he had locked the door the previous night, but in the morning it stood ajar, the key nowhere to be found. He questioned the family again, his voice tight with frustration. "Who has been taking the keys?" he demanded, his eyes darting from face to face. No one answered. The silence in the room was heavy, punctuated only by the crackle of the kitchen fire. That night, as the family prepared for bed, Andreas made a point of checking every door and window. He slid the wooden bolt into place, tested the locks, and pocketed the remaining keys. He lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. At some point, he drifted into a restless slumber. He was awakened by a sound, a faint, rhythmic creaking, like someone pacing back and forth above his head. For a moment, he thought it must be the house settling, or perhaps a rat scurrying in the eaves. But as he listened, the noise grew louder, more deliberate. It was the unmistakable cadence of footsteps, slow, measured, as if someone were walking the length of the attic, pausing, then turning and retracing their steps. Andreas sat up in bed, his heart pounding. He strained to hear, holding his breath. The footsteps continued, moving from one end of the attic to the other. He glanced at Kazilia, who slept beside him, undisturbed. He considered waking her, but something in the quality of the sound, its persistence, its human rhythm, made him hesitate. He rose quietly, pulling on his trousers and reaching for the lantern. The house was cold, shadows pooling in the corners. He crept into the hallway, the boards creaking under his weight. At the foot of the attic stairs, he paused, listening. The footsteps had stopped. He climbed the narrow steps, the lantern casting flickering patterns on the walls. At the top, he pushed open the attic door and swept the light across the empty space. Dust motes danced in the beam, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no displaced boxes, nothing. He stood there for a long moment, the silence pressing in on him. Then, with a shiver, he closed the door and descended the stairs. He told himself it was nothing, just the wind, or the house settling. But the next night, the footsteps returned. This time, Victoria heard them too. She woke in the darkness, her heart racing, the sound of footsteps echoing above her head. She lay frozen, listening as the steps moved back and forth, pausing, then starting again. She pulled the covers over her head, willing the noise to stop. In the morning, she told her father what she had heard. Andreas nodded grimly. "I heard it too," he said. The family began to speak of the noises in hushed tones, as if afraid that acknowledging them would give them power. The children sensed the tension, clinging to their mother and refusing to sleep alone. Maria, the maid, grew pale and withdrawn. She confided to Victoria that she felt watched, even when she was alone in her room. "There is something wrong in this house," she whispered. Andreas redoubled his efforts to secure the house. He set traps in the attic, hoping to catch a rat or a stray animal. He checked the locks every night, keeping the remaining keys on his person at all times. But the noises persisted, growing louder, more insistent. Sometimes, the footsteps were accompanied by other sounds, a soft thump, a scraping, the faint rattle of a doorknob. One evening, as the family sat around the kitchen table, a sudden crash echoed from above. The adults froze, listening. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the footsteps resumed, moving quickly across the attic floor. Andreas leapt to his feet, grabbing the lantern. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice trembling with anger and fear. He climbed the stairs two at a time, the lantern swinging wildly. At the top, he flung open the attic door. The space was empty, the only movement the swirling dust in the lantern's beam. He searched every corner, every trunk and crate, but found nothing. He returned to the kitchen, his face pale. "There is no one there," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The family began to dread the coming of night. Each sunset brought with it a renewed sense of vulnerability, as if the darkness itself was pressing in on them. The missing keys were never found. The footsteps in the attic became a nightly torment, a reminder that their sanctuary had been breached. Neighbors who heard the story shook their heads. "It's just an old house," they said. "You're imagining things." But the Grubers knew what they had heard. They knew that someone or something was moving through their home, unseen and uninvited. In the final days before the tragedy, the atmosphere in Hinterkaifeck was one of mounting terror. The family moved through their routines in a state of constant vigilance, their nerves frayed by sleepless nights and the unrelenting sense of being watched. The house, once a refuge, had become a prison, a place where every shadow had a threat, and every sound was a harbinger of doom. And all the while, the footsteps in the attic continued, pacing back and forth, as if marking time until the inevitable end. The morning of March 31st, 1922, dawned gray and cold over the snow-mottled fields of Bavaria. The woods around Hinterkaifeck stood bare and silent, their skeletal branches scratching at a sky the color of old tin. In the kitchen, a hush had settled over the Gruber household. Every member of the family moved with a kind of mechanical caution, as if even the smallest sound might disturb the uneasy peace that had settled over the farmstead. There was a sense that something was coming, something inevitable and inescapable. It was on this morning that Maria Baumgartner arrived. Maria was 44 years old, a sturdy woman from the nearby town of Schobenhausen. She had spent most of her life in service, moving from one farm to another, her hands hardened by years of scrubbing and mending, her back bent from labor. She was not a woman given to flights of fancy or idle gossip. She had seen hardship and survived it. Yet even she felt a tremor of unease as she approached Hinterkaifeck for the first time. She did not come alone. Her sister, Franziska, accompanied her, an act of kindness, but also of caution. The stories about the Gruber family had traveled far beyond the borders of Grobern. People whispered about their isolation, about the strange happenings on the farm. The previous maid had left abruptly, claiming the house was haunted. Maria had dismissed these tales as foolishness, but as she and Franziska trudged up the muddy lane, the house looming before them like a brooding sentinel, she felt the weight of those stories pressing in. The Grubers greeted Maria with a mixture of relief and reserve. Andreas, the patriarch, was brusque, his handshake firm but perfunctory. Casilia, his wife, offered a thin, tired smile. Victoria, the daughter, looked Maria up and down with a wary, appraising gaze. The children, little Casilia and Joseph, peered out from behind their mother's skirts, wide-eyed and silent. Maria's arrival was not marked by warmth or welcome. The house was cold, the kitchen fire burning low. Her room was small and sparsely furnished, a narrow bed, a washstand, a single window that looked out over the bleak yard. She unpacked her few belongings in silence, her sister hovering nearby. Franziska lingered, reluctant to leave her sister in the strange, somber place. She helped Maria settle in, smoothing the thin blanket on the bed, placing a small crucifix on the nightstand. "If you need anything, you send word," Franziska said quietly, her voice edged with worry. Maria nodded, forcing a smile. "I'll be fine. It's just a farm, after all." But as Franziska prepared to leave, she hesitated at the door, glancing back at her sister. "Be careful, Maria," she whispered. "There's something not right here." Maria watched her sister walk down the lane, her figure growing smaller and smaller until she disappeared into the trees. The day passed in a blur of chores and small talk. Maria scrubbed floors, peeled potatoes, washed linens. She learned the rhythms of the household. Andreas's sharp commands, Victoria's quiet sadness, the children's subdued play. She noticed the tension that threaded through every interaction, the way the family glanced at each other when they thought she wasn't looking. There were secrets here, she realized, secrets that hung in the air like the scent of old smoke. As evening fell, the sense of unease deepened. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters. The family gathered for supper, their voices low, their eyes darting to the windows as if expecting someone, or something, to appear out of the darkness. Maria ate in silence, her appetite dulled by the oppressive atmosphere. After supper, Maria helped clear the table and wash the dishes. She listened as Andreas bolted the doors and checked the locks, his movements brusque and methodical. She heard Victoria murmur a prayer as she tucked the children into bed. The house seemed to shrink as night fell, the shadows growing longer, the silence more profound. Maria retired to her room, her body aching from the day's labor. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the window at the moonlit yard. She thought of her sister, of the warmth and laughter of home. She wondered what had driven the previous maid away, what had made her flee in the middle of the night. As she lay down, Maria listened to the sounds of the house settling, the creak of floorboards, the sigh of the wind. She tried to calm her racing thoughts, to convince herself that she was safe. But as she drifted towards sleep, she heard it, a faint, rhythmic creaking from above, as if someone were pacing back and forth in the attic. She froze, her heart pounding. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, moving from one end of the house to the other. Maria pulled the blanket up to her chin, her breath shallow. She told herself it was nothing, just the wind, or a rat in the rafters. But the sound persisted, growing louder, more insistent. In that moment, Maria understood the fear that had driven the previous maid away. She understood the tension that gripped the Gruber family, the sense of being watched, of being hunted. She lay awake for hours, listening to the footsteps above, praying for morning. But morning would not bring safety. For Maria Baumgartner, March 31st, 1922, would be both her first and last day at Hinterkaifeck. The house that had seemed merely strange and somber would soon reveal itself as something far more sinister, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead, between the seen and the unseen, had been fatally blurred. And as the night deepened, as the footsteps in the attic continued their relentless pacing, Maria realized that she was not alone, that none of them were. Nightfall at Hinterkaifeck was always a slow, creeping thing, a gradual surrender of the world to darkness, the last rays of sun slipping behind the trees, leaving the farmhouse and its outbuildings adrift in a sea of shadow. On March 31st, 1922, the darkness felt heavier than ever, as if the very air was thickening, pressing in on the Gruber family. The day had been tense, marked by uneasy glances and whispered worries. The new maid, Maria Baumgartner, had settled into her small room, her belongings barely unpacked. The children, little Casilia and Joseph, were restless, their laughter subdued, their eyes darting to the windows as the wind rattled the shutters. Andreas Gruber moved through the house with a kind of grim determination, checking locks, peering into corners, his mind still troubled by the missing keys and the footsteps in the attic. Victoria, his daughter, tried to keep the household calm, her voice gentle as she coaxed the children to eat their supper. Casilia, the elder, clung to her mother's skirt, while Joseph babbled in his crib, oblivious to the tension that gripped the adults. As the evening deepened, a strange quiet settled over the farm. The usual sounds, the lowing of the cows, the clatter of dishes, the crackle of the kitchen fire, seemed muffled, distant. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and the faint, metallic tang of snow. The sky was clouded, the moon a pale smudge behind a veil of gray. It was then that the first disturbance came, a sharp, urgent bark from one of the cows in the barn, followed by a sudden, frantic commotion. Andreas, ever the caretaker, stood up abruptly from the table. "Something's wrong with the cattle," he muttered, grabbing his coat. He hesitated for a moment, glancing at his family. "Stay inside," he said, his voice gruff. "I'll be back in a moment." He stepped out into the cold, the door creaking shut behind him. The yard was silent, the barn looming in the darkness, its doors slightly ajar. Andreas moved quickly, his boots crunching through the thin crust of snow. He pushed open the barn door and stepped inside, the smell of hay and animal must filling his nostrils. He never saw the shadow that moved behind him, silent and swift. There was a sudden, blinding pain, a heavy blow to the back of his head, and then nothing. Andreas crumpled to the straw, his body twitching once before going still. Back in the house, the minutes ticked by. Casilia, the elder, grew anxious. "Where's Opa?" she asked, her voice small. Victoria tried to reassure her, but she, too, was uneasy. The barn was never left unattended for long, especially not at night. After a few moments, Casilia insisted on going to find her grandfather. "I'll be quick, Mama," she pleaded, her eyes wide with worry. Victoria hesitated, then nodded, her own nerves fraying. "Be careful," she whispered. Casilia pulled on her coat and slipped out the door, the cold biting at her cheeks. She hurried across the yard, the barn looming ahead. She pushed open the door, peering into the dimness. "Opa," she called, her voice trembling. There was no answer. She stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the glow. She saw her grandfather's body sprawled in the straw, blood pooling beneath his head. Before she could scream, a figure emerged from the shadows, a faceless shape, wielding a heavy, gleaming mattock. The weapon arced through the air, striking her down. The barn swallowed her scream. Inside the house, Victoria's unease turned to fear. She waited, listening for footsteps, for voices, for any sign that her father and daughter were returning. The silence grew oppressive. At last, unable to bear it any longer, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. The night was colder now, the wind biting, the darkness absolute. She moved quickly across the yard, her heart pounding. The barn door stood open, swinging slightly in the wind. She stepped inside, calling out for her father and daughter. The scene that greeted her was one of horror. Andreas and little Casilia, lifeless in the straw, their bodies twisted, blood staining the hay. Victoria gasped, stumbling backward. Before she could flee, the same shadowy figure appeared, the mattock raised high. She tried to scream, but the blow came swift and merciless, silencing her forever. Back in the house, old Casilia waited, her hands trembling, her breath shallow. She listened for the sound of returning footsteps, for the familiar voices of her family. Instead, there was only silence, broken by the distant howl of the wind. At last, driven by a mixture of fear and desperation, she ventured outside, her frail body shivering in the cold. She crossed the yard, her slippers slipping on the icy ground. The barn door loomed ahead, a black maw in the darkness. She stepped inside, her eyes searching the glow. She saw the bodies, her husband, her granddaughter, her daughter, lying motionless in the straw. Before she could turn away, the killer struck, the mattock descending with brutal force. For members of the Gruber family lay dead in the barn, their bodies hidden beneath piles of hay. The killer worked quickly and efficiently, dragging each victim deeper into the shadows, covering them with straw and debris. The barn, once a place of life and labor, had become a tomb. Back in the house, Maria Baumgartner sat in her small room, her nerves frayed by the tension of the day. She heard the distant sounds, the creak of the barn door, the muffled thud of footsteps, but told herself it was nothing, just the usual noises of a farm at night. She tried to sleep, but her mind raced, replaying every strange occurrence, every whispered warning. She did not know that the killer was already making their way toward the house, moving silently through the darkness, the mattock still slick with blood. The night at Hinterkaifeck stretched on, cold and merciless, as the shadows grew deeper and the silence more profound. The farmstead, once a place of uneasy peace, had become a scene of unspeakable horror, a place where the darkness had finally claimed its due. The barn at Hinterkaifeck was silent now, its grim work finished. Outside, the wind had died, and a suffocating stillness pressed down on the farmstead. The moon, veiled by clouds, cast only the faintest light across the yard, illuminating the trampled snow, and the barn door left swinging gently on its hinges. In the farmhouse, the last flickers of lamplight glowed behind curtained windows. Inside, two souls remained, unaware that death, having claimed the others, was already at the threshold. Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, lay in her narrow bed, her body rigid with exhaustion and unease. The day had been long and strange, the Gruber family's tension seeping into her bones. She had tried to sleep, but every creak of the old house, every whisper of wind, set her nerves on edge. She clutched her rosary beneath the thin blanket, murmuring prayers for protection. The footsteps in the attic, the missing keys, the haunted looks on her employers' faces, all circled in her mind like restless ghosts. In the adjacent room, little Joseph slept in his crib, the faint rise and fall of his breath the only sign of innocence left in the house. The child's cheeks were flushed with sleep, his small fist curled around the edge of his blanket. The world outside was vast and cold, but here, in the soft glow of the oil lamp, he was safe, or so it seemed. But the killer was already inside. No one knows for certain how the murderer entered the house. Perhaps he carried a stolen key, perhaps a door had been left unlatched in the confusion. What is known is that he moved with the patience and certainty of someone who had studied the rhythms of the family, who knew the layout of the rooms, the location of every creaking floorboard. He moved through the darkness like a shadow, silent and remorseless. Maria awoke to a sound, a soft, deliberate footfall in the hallway. For a moment, she thought it was Victoria or old Casilia, returning from the barn. But the house was wrong, the air charged with a sense of finality. She sat up, clutching her blanket, her heart pounding. The door to her room creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. In the dim light, she saw only the glint of metal, the outline of a heavy mattock raised high. There was no time to scream. The blow fell with terrible force, and Maria crumpled to the bed, her prayers silenced forever. The killer did not pause. He moved through the house with grim efficiency, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. In the nursery, Joseph stirred in his sleep, perhaps sensing the presence that now loomed over him. The child's eyes fluttered open for a moment, confusion and fear flickering across his face. The killer raised the mattock once more, and with a single, merciless strike, the last of the Gruber family was silenced. The house was utterly still. The only sounds were the faint ticking of the clock in the parlor and the slow drip of blood onto the floorboards. The killer stood for a moment in the darkness, listening to the silence he had created. Then, with the same eerie calm that had marked every step of his grim work, he set about erasing the traces of his presence. He covered Maria's body with her bedsheet, tucking it in as if to grant her a final, mocking kindness. He arranged Joseph's blanket over the child's lifeless form, smoothing it with a tenderness that belied the brutality of his actions. He moved through the house, extinguishing lamps, closing doors, restoring order to the chaos he had wrought. Outside, the wind began to rise again, rattling the shutters and carrying away the last echoes of violence. The farmhouse, once filled with the sounds of life, laughter, music, the cries of children, was now a tomb. 6 lives had been snuffed out in the space of a single night, their bodies left where they fell, their secrets buried with them. The killer did not flee. Instead, he remained in the house for days, tending the animals, eating the family's food, sleeping in their beds. He moved through the rooms with the familiarity of someone who belonged, his presence a chilling violation of the sanctuary the Grubers had tried so desperately to protect. And so, as the world outside went on, neighbors passing by, the postman delivering letters, the church bells tolling in the distance, the house at Hinterkaifeck stood silent, its windows dark, its doors locked tight. Inside, the killer waited, unseen and unknown, his work complete. But the horror he left behind would echo through the years, haunting the village, the investigators, and all who heard the tale. The farmhouse would become a place of legend, a symbol of dread and unanswered questions. And the memory of that night, the night when innocence was extinguished and evil walked unchallenged, would never fade. The slaughter at Hinterkaifeck was not the end, but the beginning of a new, more disturbing silence. The barn and farmhouse, once alive with the rhythms of rural toil and family routine, now existed in a strange, suspended state, caught between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. In the days that followed the murders, the farm did not fall into the chaos of abandonment. Instead, it carried on, as if animated by some unseen hand. Smoke continued to rise from the chimney. The animals were fed and watered. The cows were milked at dawn and dusk. The dog was heard barking. In the village, neighbors noted with a mixture of relief and confusion that life at Hinterkaifeck appeared undisturbed. But inside, the truth was unspeakable. The killer did not flee into the night. He stayed. Perhaps he washed the blood from his hands in the icy water of the kitchen basin, scrubbing beneath his fingernails as the first light of morning crept through the frost-streaked windows. Perhaps he stood for a moment in the quiet kitchen, listening to the ticking of the clock, the only sound in a house otherwise stilled by violence. He would have known the routines, when to light the stove, how to coax the cows into the milking stalls, which feed to give the chickens. He moved through the rooms with a familiarity that was chilling, as if he belonged there, as if the house itself accepted his presence. Outside, the world continued its slow turn toward spring. The snow melted in patches, revealing muddy ruts in the lane and tufts of last year's grass. The villagers of Grobern, who had grown accustomed to the Gruber family's reclusive ways, saw nothing amiss. They noted the smoke rising from the chimney, the animals grazing in the yard, the faint glow of lamplight in the evenings. The mailman left letters at the gate. Children passed by on their way to school, glancing at the house with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Inside, the killer established a grim routine. Each morning, he rose before dawn, just as Andreas Gruber had done. He donned the old man's work coat, its pockets heavy with keys and bits of string. He moved to the barn, milking the cows, tossing feed to the chickens, mucking out the stalls. The animals, creatures of habit, responded to his touch, their needs overriding any sense of unease. The dog, a loyal creature, barked and wagged its tail, accepting the food and water offered by this new master. After tending the animals, the killer returned to the house. He prepared simple meals, bread, cheese, cold sausage, eating at the kitchen table where the family had once gathered. He lit fires in the stove, warming the rooms against the lingering chill. At night, he slept in one of the beds, pulling the covers up to his chin, drifting into a sleep undisturbed by guilt or remorse. He moved through the house with a careful, deliberate calm. He avoided the rooms where the bodies lay, or perhaps he did not. Perhaps he stood for long moments in the doorway, looking at the lifeless forms of Maria and Joseph, their faces pale in the dim light. Perhaps he whispered to them, words lost to the silence. Perhaps he felt nothing at all. The days passed in this unnatural stillness. The killer maintained the illusion of normalcy, performing the task that would keep suspicion at bay. He drew the curtains at dusk, lit the lamps, wound the clock. He made sure the animals were cared for, the fires tended, the house kept in order. To the outside world, Hinterkaifeck appeared unchanged, a lonely farmstead, inhabited by a family too private for visitors. But inside, the house was a tomb. The bodies of Andreas, Kazilia, Victoria, and little Kazilia lay hidden in the barn, covered with hay and straw. Maria and Joseph remained in their beds, shrouded in blankets. The killer moved among them, a silent warden in a house of the dead. There are those who believe he lingered out of necessity, waiting for the roads to clear, for the snow to melt, for the risk of discovery to lessen. Others think he stayed out of compulsion, unable to leave the scene of his crime, drawn again and again to the place where he had asserted his terrible power. Some have suggested he was driven by madness, or by a twisted sense of belonging, as if he had finally found a home among the ghosts. Whatever the reason, his presence was felt in every corner of the house. The neighbors, when they finally came to investigate, would find evidence of a stay: food missing from the pantry, fires burned low in the grate, animal stalls freshly marked. They would see the signs of life in a place that should have been abandoned, and they would shudder at the thought of the killer moving through the rooms, unseen and unknown. For days, Hinterkaifeck existed in this liminal state, a farmstead maintained by the very hand that had destroyed its inhabitants. The killer's calm, methodical care only deepened the horror, blurring the line between the ordinary and the monstrous. The world outside remained oblivious, the routines of rural life continuing unbroken, even as death lingered in the shadows. And so, the house waited, its secrets hidden behind locked doors and shuttered windows, the fires burning low, the animals fed, the killer moving through the silence, unhurried and unafraid. In the rural heart of Bavaria, the rhythms of village life are as predictable as the turning of the seasons. Church bells mark the passage of time, their peal echoing across fields and forests, calling the faithful to prayer. School children trudge along muddy lanes in the morning, their laughter and chatter drifting through the crisp air. In such a world, absence is noticed. Silence is suspicious. And at Hinterkaifeck, the silence was growing louder with each passing day. On Sunday, April 2nd, 1922, the pew that belonged to the Gruber family sat conspicuously empty. Victoria Gabriel, known for her clear soprano voice, was missing from the choir. Old Kazilia, who never missed a service, was absent as well. Even little Kazilia, whose fidgeting during sermons was a familiar sight, was nowhere to be seen. Parishioners exchanged uneasy glances as the priest began his homily, their eyes drawn again and again to the vacant seats. After the service, whispers rippled through the congregation. Perhaps they're ill, someone suggested, or snowed in. But the weather had turned mild, and the lane to Hinterkaifeck, though muddy, was passable. Others recalled seeing smoke from the farmhouse chimney just the day before. They must be home, said another, but her tone was uncertain. On Monday, the unease deepened. Little Kazilia did not appear at school. The teacher, her mayor, made a note in his ledger and asked the other children if they'd seen her. No, her Lara, they replied, eyes wide. She wasn't at home when we passed by. The postman, delivering mail to the farm, found the letters from the previous week still piled in the box, untouched. By Tuesday, the concern had grown into quiet alarm. Victoria's absence from choir practice was unprecedented. She was the anchor of the small group, her voice lifting the spirits of the entire congregation. The choir director, Frau Steiner, sent her son to the farm with a basket of bread and a note, but he returned, pale and breathless, saying that no one had answered the door, though he'd seen the dog in the yard and heard the cows lowing in the barn. Neighbors began to talk in earnest. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, whose farm lay closest to Hinterkaifeck, grew especially anxious. He had always kept a wary eye on the Grubers, his relationship with Victoria complicated by rumor and old wounds. He remembered the stories of missing keys, the strange footprints in the snow, the tales of footsteps in the attic. Now, with the family vanished, his unease became a gnawing dread. On Wednesday, the schoolteacher sent a note to the village constable, expressing his concern. "The Gruber family has not been seen for several days," he wrote. "Their absence from both church and school is most unusual. I fear something may be amiss." The constable, accustomed to the eccentricities of rural families, was slow to act. "They're probably visiting relatives," he said. "Or perhaps they've taken ill." But the evidence of something wrong was mounting. The animals at Hinterkaifeck were growing restless. The dog barked incessantly, its cries carrying across the fields. The cows, usually milked twice a day, bellowed with discomfort, their udders swollen. Smoke still rose from the chimney, but no one came or went from the house. The windows remained shuttered, the doors tightly closed. By Thursday, the tension in the village was palpable. Groups of neighbors gathered at the edge of the lane, casting anxious glances toward the distant farmstead. "We should go and check," someone finally said. "It's not right, this silence." But old fears lingered. The Grubers were a private family, and their land was their own. Trespassing, even out of concern, was not done lightly. It was Lorenz Schlittenbauer who finally took action. Unable to shake the sense of foreboding, he gathered 2 other men, Michael Pohl and Jacob Sigel, and set out for Hinterkaifeck. The 3 walked in silence, their boots sinking into the muddy ruts, the air thick with apprehension. As they approached the farm, the dog barked furiously, straining at its chain. The barn doors stood slightly open, swaying in the wind. They called out, their voices echoing across the yard. "Andreas! Victoria! Is anyone home?" There was no answer. The only sounds were the frantic barking of the dog and the uneasy shifting of the cows in the barn. The men exchanged uneasy glances. "We have to look," Lorenz said, his voice tight. He led the way into the barn, his heart pounding. The others followed, their lanterns casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. Inside, the smell hit them first, a thick, metallic stench that turned their stomachs. The animals shifted nervously, their eyes rolling white in the dim light. The men moved deeper into the barn, their footsteps muffled by straw. And then, beneath a pile of hay, they found the bodies. The horror of the discovery would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But in that moment, as the truth began to dawn, the silence that had shrouded Hinterkaifeck was finally broken. The neighbors' concern had become a nightmare, and the mystery of the Gruber family's disappearance had given way to a crime that would shock the world. April 4th, 1922. The morning broke cold and gray, the sky hanging low over the muddy lanes of Grober. By now, the entire village was uneasy. The Gruber family's absence from church, school, and the rhythms of daily life had become impossible to ignore. Their farm, usually so self-contained, now seemed ominously silent. Except for the dog's insistent barking and the restless lowing of the cows, sounds that drifted across the fields and set the neighbors' nerves on edge. Lorenz Schlittenbauer could stand it no longer. He had known the Grubers for years, sometimes as a neighbor, sometimes as a rival, sometimes as the subject of whispered rumors and complicated ties. He gathered 2 men, Michael Pohl and Jacob Sigel, and together they set out for Hinterkaifeck, their boots sinking into the soft, thawing earth. Each step toward the isolated farmstead was heavy with dread. As they approached, the dog barked wildly, straining at its chain. The barn door stood slightly ajar, swaying in the wind. The windows of the house were shuttered tight, the curtains drawn. The men called out, "Andreas! Victoria! Is anyone home?" But their voices echoed back at them, unanswered. The yard, usually swept and orderly, was littered with muddy footprints and scattered straw. The animals in the barn were agitated, their stalls fouled, their eyes rolling white with distress. The search party hesitated at the threshold, the weight of what they might find pressing down on them. Lorenz was the first to step inside the barn. The air was thick with the stench of animals and something else, something coppery and foul that caught in the back of the throat. The light was dim, filtering through cracks in the walls, casting long, wavering shadows across the straw-strewn floor. They moved cautiously, their lanterns trembling in their hands. At first, they saw nothing amiss, just the restless cattle, the clutter of tools and feed. But then, in a darkened corner, beneath a pile of hay, they saw it. A foot, pale and still, protruding from the straw. Lorenz froze. The others crowded behind him, their breath coming in shallow gasps. With shaking hands, they pulled away the hay, revealing a scene of unspeakable horror. There lay Andreas Gruber, his head caved in, his body twisted in the straw. Beside him, old Casilia, her face frozen in a rictus of terror. Victoria Gabriel, her hair matted with blood. And little Casilia, her small body crumpled, her face bruised and battered. The men staggered back, retching, their minds struggling to comprehend the carnage. The bodies had been carefully arranged, stacked one atop the other, partially covered with hay and an old door. It was as if the killer had tried to hide them, but not well enough. For a long moment, the barn was silent except for the frantic beating of their hearts and the shuffling of the animals. Then Lorenz, his face ashen, whispered, "We have to check the house." They crossed the yard, their legs leaden, their hands trembling. The front door was locked, but Lorenz found a key, one of the missing ones, perhaps hidden beneath a flower pot. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. The kitchen table was set for a meal that would never be eaten. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, indifferent to the horror that had unfolded. They moved from room to room, calling out the names of the family, hoping against hope for a reply. In the maid's small room, they found Maria Baumgartner, her body sprawled on the bed, her face hidden by a pillow. Blood stained the sheets, the wall, the floor. In the nursery, the final horror awaited. Little Joseph lay in his crib, silent and still, a dark stain spreading across his blanket. The room was cold, the air heavy with the scent of death. The men stumbled back outside, gasping for air, their faces drained of color. Lorenz fell to his knees, his hands shaking, his eyes wide with shock. "All of them," he whispered. "They're all dead." Word spread quickly through the village. Soon, a crowd had gathered at the edge of the yard. Neighbors, friends, the curious and the horrified. The constable arrived, then the local magistrate, then investigators from Munich. The house and barn were swarmed by officials, their boots trampling the muddy yard, their voices hushed and urgent. Inside, the investigators found evidence of a crime both brutal and methodical. The bodies bore the marks of savage blows, delivered with a heavy, sharp instrument, a mattock, later found hidden in the attic. The killer had moved through the house with chilling calm, covering the bodies, tending the animals, lighting fires in the stove. But who could have done such a thing? And why? The questions swirled through the village like the cold spring wind, unsettling everyone they touched. As the sun set over Hinterkaifeck, the farm was no longer just a place of isolation and suspicion. It was a crime scene, a house of horrors, a mystery that would haunt Bavaria and the world for generations to come. The grisly discovery at Hinterkaifeck spread through Grobern and the surrounding villages like wildfire. By the time the authorities arrived, the farmstead was already a spectacle. Neighbors, drawn by horror and curiosity, crowded the muddy yard, their faces pale with shock, their voices hushed as they exchanged rumors and theories. Some wept openly, others simply stared at the shuttered house and barn, as if trying to comprehend the enormity of what had happened behind those walls. Inside, the scene was a tangle of confusion and fear. The search party, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, Michael Pohl, Jacob Sigel, had left muddy footprints across the barn floor, their lanterns knocking over buckets and scattering straw. In their panic and revulsion, they had moved the bodies, pulling away hay and debris in a desperate attempt to confirm what their eyes could barely process. The corpses of Andreas, Kazilia, Victoria, and little Kazilia lay exposed, their clothing torn, their faces battered beyond recognition. By midday, more villagers had arrived, pressing into the barn, craning their necks for a glimpse of the horror. Some crossed themselves, others whispered prayers. A few, unable to contain their morbid fascination, poked at the straw with sticks, searching for more evidence. In the house, the chaos was no less severe. Neighbors wandered from room to room, opening cupboards, peering under beds, handling objects with nervous, trembling hands. Someone lit the kitchen stove, trying to dispel the chill, inadvertently destroying potential fingerprints. Another neighbor, seeking comfort, straightened the tablecloth and swept crumbs from the floor, erasing subtle clues left by the killer. When the police finally arrived from Munich, they found a scene already hopelessly compromised. The constable, overwhelmed by the scale of the crime, did little to control the crowd. Investigators, some in uniform and others in plain clothes, fanned out across the property, their boots tracking mud and blood from room to room. They questioned neighbors and witnesses in hurried tones, scribbling notes on scraps of paper, their faces tight with disbelief and exhaustion. The barn became the focal point of the investigation. Officers measured distances, cataloged the positions of the bodies, and searched for the murder weapon. But the evidence was already muddled, footprints overlapped, hay was scattered, and the original arrangement of the corpses was lost to memory and panic. In the attic, where the killer may have hidden or watched, curious villagers had already trampled through the dust, obliterating any chance of finding clear prints or personal effects. The investigators worked late into the night, their lanterns casting flickering shadows on the bloodstained walls. They found the mattock, its blade crusted with gore, hidden in the rafters. They collected scraps of clothing, broken jewelry, and a handful of coins, but the meaning of these items was lost in the confusion. Every piece of evidence was touched, moved, or contaminated by the hands of the living, neighbors, police, and officials alike. Outside, the crowd grew larger as word spread to neighboring towns. Journalists arrived, their notepads ready, their questions sharp and insistent. The farmstead, once a place of solitude and secrecy, was now a stage for public spectacle. The Gruber family's tragedy had become communal property, their suffering dissected and debated in the muddy yard and the smoky taverns of Grobern. In the aftermath, the authorities struggled to reconstruct the sequence of events. The timeline was blurred, the motives obscured. Suspects were questioned and released, rumors multiplied, and the killer's trail grew cold. The chaos of the crime scene, born of fear, curiosity, and a desperate need to understand, had destroyed the very evidence that might have brought justice. And so, Hinterkaifeck remained a place of unanswered questions, its secrets buried beneath layers of confusion and the careless footprints of the living. The house and barn, once so familiar, had become a labyrinth of dread, their walls echoing with the voices of the dead and the living alike, each one searching, in vain, for the truth. The farmhouse at Hinterkaifeck, once a place of uneasy routine, had become a theater of horror. As police and villagers milled about the yard and barn, the bodies of the Gruber family and their maid lay where they had fallen, silent witnesses to a violence that defied comprehension. The investigators, overwhelmed by the chaos of the scene and the press of curious onlookers, knew that the next step was both necessary and dreadful: the autopsies. There was no proper morgue in the village, no sterile hospital room for such work. Instead, the barn itself became the grim theater for the examination of the dead. Dr. Johann Baptist Allmüller, the court physician from nearby Schrobenhausen, arrived with his black bag and a face set in grim determination. The villagers gathered at the door, some crossing themselves, others whispering prayers, all straining to catch a glimpse of the proceedings. The bodies, already disturbed and exposed by the search party and neighbors, were laid out on makeshift tables, rough boards set atop barrels, straw scattered beneath to soak up the blood. The doctor began with Andreas Gruber, the patriarch. Even in death, his features bore the stamp of stubbornness and suspicion. But now, those features were distorted by violence. Dr. Allmüller examined the wounds. The skull was shattered, the scalp split open by repeated blows. The weapon, he surmised, was heavy and sharp, a mattock, perhaps, or a similar farm tool. The blows had been delivered with such force that bone fragments were driven into the brain. There were defensive wounds on the old man's hands and arms. He had tried, futilely, to ward off the attack. Next was Kazilia, the grandmother. Her injuries were similar: deep lacerations to the head, a fractured skull, blood matted in her hair. But there was something else, a ligature mark around her throat. Faint but unmistakable. Had she been strangled before the final blows fell? Or had the killer sought to silence her screams as he brought the weapon down? The doctor could not say for certain, but the evidence spoke of a struggle, of terror and pain drawn out over agonizing moments. Victoria Gabriel, the widowed daughter, lay beside her parents. Her wounds were the most severe. The right side of her face was caved in, her jaw shattered, her neck bruised and swollen. Dr. Allmüller noted signs of strangulation, as if the killer had tried to throttle her before delivering the fatal blows. There were other marks, too suggestive of a desperate fight, of hands clawing at her attacker, of a final, futile attempt to escape. But it was little Kazilia, the 7-year-old child, whose injuries haunted the doctor most. Her skull was split, her face bruised and swollen. But there was evidence that she had not died immediately. Clumps of her own hair were found in her hands, torn out in agony as she lay dying beside her family. The thought of the child, conscious and suffering for hours after the attack, chilled even the most hardened investigators. Inside the house, the bodies of Maria Baumgartner and Joseph were examined next. Maria, the maid, had been struck in the head as she lay in bed, the blow so powerful that it drove fragments of bone into her brain. There were no signs of struggle. She had likely been asleep, or at least unaware, when death came. Joseph, the 2-year-old, was found in his crib, a single, savage blow to the head ending his short life. The violence visited upon the youngest and most defenseless victim seemed, to the villagers, a particular kind of evil. As Dr. Allmüller worked, he dictated his findings to the police, his voice steady but strained. Each body told a story of brutality and rage, of a killer who had acted with both precision and savagery. The wounds were not random, they were deliberate, methodical, as if the murderer had taken a grim satisfaction in his work. The marks of strangulation on Victoria and her mother suggested a personal hatred, an urge to silence as much as to kill. The autopsies also revealed the passage of time. Rigor mortis had set in, the body stiff and cold. The wounds, though horrific, showed no signs of healing. Death had come swiftly, but not painlessly. The presence of undigested food in the stomach suggested the family had been killed not long after their evening meal, perhaps as they went about their nightly chores. The killer had struck at a moment of vulnerability, then lingered on the property, leaving among the dead. The villagers, listening to the doctor's grim recitation, shuddered. They had known violence before. Bavaria was no stranger to hardship and loss, but this was something different. This was cruelty for its own sake, suffering inflicted not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. The marks on the bodies, the evidence of prolonged agony, the slaughter of a child in his crib, all spoke of a darkness that defied explanation. The police, for their part, struggled to make sense of the findings. The brutality of the murders suggested a personal motive, a hatred that went beyond mere robbery or revenge. But the absence of a clear suspect, the confusion of the crime scene, and the lack of witnesses left them grasping at shadows. The autopsies raised more questions than they answered. Who could hate the Grubers so much? Who could kill with such cold efficiency, then remain on the farm, tending the animals, eating the family's food, sleeping in their beds? As the sun set over Hinterkaifeck, the barn and house stood silent once more. The bodies, now examined and catalogued, were prepared for burial. The villagers drifted away, their faces drawn and pale, their minds haunted by images they could not forget. The investigators packed their bags, their notebooks filled with grisly details but empty of answers. In the days that followed, the story of the autopsy spread through the region, fueling fear and speculation. The brutality of the murders, the signs of prolonged suffering, the evidence of strangulation and rage, all became part of the legend of Hinterkaifeck, a story whispered in taverns and kitchens, a warning to those who thought themselves safe in their own homes. And so, the mystery deepened. The dead were laid to rest, but the questions remained, echoing through the empty rooms and shadowed fields of Hinterkaifeck, a place forever marked by violence, and by the suffering that lingered long after the last blow fell. The investigation at Hinterkaifeck had already uncovered horrors beyond imagining: 6 brutal murders, a family slaughtered in their own home and barn, their bodies left where they fell or hidden beneath hay. Yet, despite the mounting evidence, one crucial piece of the puzzle remained elusive: the murder weapon. Without it, the full story of that terrible night could not be told. Days after the bodies were discovered, as investigators methodically searched every corner of the farmstead, attention turned to the attic, the very space where footsteps had been heard before the killings, where the killer might have lurked unseen. It was a cramped, shadowed loft, filled with forgotten tools, dusty crates, and the detritus of years of rural life. The air was thick with the sin of old wood and stale dust, and the floorboards creaked ominously beneath the weight of the searchers. The attic was a place of secrets, and on this day, it would reveal one of the darkest. Among the clutter, a glint caught the eye of one of the officers, a long, heavy tool, its wooden handle worn smooth by use, its metal head stained with rust and something darker. It was a mattock, a farming implement used for breaking ground and chopping roots. But here, in the silent loft, it was no longer a tool of labor. It was a weapon. The mattock was carefully lowered to the floor, examined by the court physician and the lead investigator. The blade bore dried blood, flecks of hair, and fragments of bone. The handle was sticky with grime and something unmistakably human. This was the instrument of death, the brutal tool that had shattered skulls, split flesh, and ended lives. The discovery sent a chill through the assembled men. The killer had hidden the weapon in the very house where he had committed his crimes, in the attic where footsteps had been heard pacing before the murders. It was as if he had wanted to keep it close, to hold on to the means of his terrible deed. The mattock became the grim centerpiece of the investigation. Forensic experts photographed it, tested the stains, and compared it to the wounds on the victims. Every detail matched the shape of the blows, the angle of the fractures, the pattern of the blood spatter. It was undeniable. But the question remained: who had wielded it? The killer's identity was still a mystery, and the weapon, though found, offered no clues beyond its deadly purpose. The attic itself became a focus of speculation. The footprints found in the snow, the missing keys, the noises heard above the family's heads, all pointed to someone who had been living or hiding in that cramped space. Had the killer been watching the family for days, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? Had he crept down from the attic to the barn and house, carrying the mattock like a grim promise? Neighbors recalled strange sounds, unexplained movements, the eerie feeling of being watched. The discovery of the mattock in the attic seemed to confirm their worst fears, that the killer had been not just a stranger, but a presence inside the very walls of the Gruber home. The investigators scoured the attic for further evidence, fibers, fingerprints, personal items, but the killer had been careful. The only trace left was the mattock itself, a silent witness to the carnage. As the days passed, the mattock was displayed in the local courthouse, a grim reminder of the violence that had shattered a quiet farming community. It became a symbol of the evil that had invaded Hinterkaifeck, a heavy, brutal instrument that had turned a home into a tomb. Yet, despite the weapon's discovery, the case remained unsolved. The killer had vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only questions and fear. The attic, cold and silent, held the secrets of that night, its blades stained with the blood of a family no longer among the living. And so, Hinterkaifeck's darkest secret lay hidden in plain sight, an ordinary farming tool transformed into an instrument of horror, found in the attic where footsteps had once echoed, a chilling testament to a crime that would haunt Germany for a century. As the sun dipped behind the Bavarian woods and the last of the day's light faded from the blood-stained yard, investigators and villagers alike gathered in the kitchen of Hinterkaifeck, their faces drawn and voices hushed. The horror of the murders had stunned the community, but as the reality set in, so too did the practical questions. Why? What could possibly drive someone to such savagery? The most obvious answer, robbery, was the first to be tested. It was a logical assumption. Isolated farmsteads like Hinterkaifeck were tempting targets for thieves. The Grubers, though not wealthy by city standards, were known to keep money in the house. Like many rural families, they distrusted banks and preferred to keep their savings close at hand. Coins hidden in jars, paper notes tucked into old books, jewelry wrapped in handkerchiefs at the bottom of drawers. If the murders had been committed for profit, the evidence would be plain. But as the police moved through the house, what they found confounded them. In the master bedroom, a locked wooden chest sat at the foot of the bed. Inside, beneath a layer of linens, were several rolls of Reichsmarks, untouched. In Victoria's room, a small jewelry box held a gold wedding ring, a silver brooch, and a string of pearls, all undisturbed. The kitchen cupboard contained a tin of coins, the household's petty cash, still full. Even the family's savings, hidden in a coffee can behind a loose brick in the pantry, remained where it had always been. No drawers had been ransacked, no cabinets forced open, no valuables missing. The investigators cataloged each item, noting their locations and apparent lack of disturbance. They questioned the neighbors. Had the Grubers ever mentioned a large sum of money or valuables recently acquired? Had anyone seen strangers lurking near the property in the days before the murders? The answers were always the same: nothing unusual, nothing missing. The barn, too, showed no signs of theft. Tools hung in their accustomed places, the wagon and plow untouched. The livestock, cows, chickens, the family dog, were alive and well, cared for with a diligence that suggested the killer had tended them after the murders. There was no evidence of hurried escape, no sign that the murderer had rifled through the farm's possessions in search of loot. This was not the work of a desperate thief, nor of a bandit seeking easy prey. The violence had been too personal, too deliberate. The killer had taken his time, moving through the house and barn with a chilling calm. He had lingered on the property for days, lighting fires, eating meals, feeding the animals. He had shown no interest in the family's modest wealth. The realization sent a fresh wave of dread through the investigators. If not robbery, then what? What motive could explain such brutality, such intimate violence? Theories began to swirl: old grudges, family secrets, madness. But none of them fit the facts as neatly as a simple theft would have. The villagers, too, struggled to make sense of it. In the taverns and kitchens of Groburn, people whispered about the killer's strange restraint. If it was money he wanted, why leave it all behind? They asked. If it was revenge, why kill the children? There were no answers, only fear. The police, desperate for a lead, re-examined every detail. They searched for signs of a hidden safe, a secret stash that might have been overlooked. They questioned distant relatives, probing for evidence of inheritance disputes or jealousies. But the Grubers' affairs were as straightforward as their lives: no hidden fortunes, no secret debts, no enemies with anything to gain. As days passed and the investigation stalled, the untouched valuables became a symbol of the case's insolubility. The killer had walked among the family's possessions, surrounded by reminders of their lives and loves, and had taken nothing but their lives. It was a crime that defied reason, a violence without profit, a mystery that deepened with every unanswered question. The untouched money and jewelry, the orderly rooms, the cared for animals, all pointed to a motive beyond greed. The investigators, staring at the evidence laid out before them, felt the weight of their own helplessness. Hinterkaifeck was not just a crime scene. It was a riddle, a place where the ordinary rules no longer applied. And so, as the farmstead slipped back into silence, the valuables remained, a mute testament to the senselessness of the crime, a clue that pointed not to a thief, but to something far darker. The killer had left behind everything of material value, and in doing so, had taken with him the peace of an entire village, leaving only fear and unanswered questions in his wake. The horror at Hinterkaifeck did not end with the burial of the Gruber family. If anything, it deepened, spreading outward from the farmstead like a stain, touching every house in Groburn and beyond. The investigators, already frustrated by the chaos of the crime scene and the absence of a clear motive, now faced the most daunting task of all, finding the killer among a sea of possible suspects. In the days and weeks that followed the discovery, the police worked tirelessly, their notebooks filling with names, alibis, and half-remembered conversations. The list of those questioned grew longer by the day. Neighbors, farmhands, relatives, traveling laborers, even vagrants who had passed through the area in the weeks before the murders. Each interview was a thread in a tapestry of suspicion, but the picture never came into focus. The first to fall under scrutiny was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who had led the search party and discovered the bodies. His history with the Grubers was complicated. Rumors swirled that he had once been romantically involved with Victoria, and some whispered that he might even have been the father of little Joseph. His behavior at the scene, unlocking doors, moving bodies, seeming to know his way around the house, raised eyebrows. But when pressed, Lorenz explained his actions as those of a concerned neighbor, desperate to help. His alibi for the night of the murders was shaky, but not impossible. The police could not make the pieces fit. Next came the itinerant workers, men who drifted from farm to farm, picking up odd jobs and sleeping in barns. Some had worked at Hinterkaifeck in the past, others had quarreled with Andreas Gruber over wages or working conditions. Each was tracked down, questioned, and, in most cases, quickly dismissed. Their stories were checked against train schedules, witness statements, and the ever-present alibi of poverty and rootlessness. The investigators also looked inward, probing the Gruber family's own secrets. Was there a feud with a distant relative? Had Victoria's rumored relationship with her father, Andreas, bred resentment or jealousy? The villagers spoke in hushed tones of family curses, of old sins coming home to roost. The police followed every lead, no matter how outlandish, but the truth remained elusive. As the investigation dragged on, the pressure mounted. The newspapers seized on every rumor, publishing lurid headlines and wild speculation. The case became a national obsession, a symbol of the darkness lurking in the countryside. The police, desperate for a breakthrough, began to cast their net wider. They questioned strangers passing through the region, checked asylum records for escaped lunatics, even consulted fortune-tellers and spiritualists in a last, desperate bid for answers. But each new suspect brought only disappointment. Alibis were confirmed, motives evaporated under scrutiny, and the evidence, already compromised by the chaotic crime scene, yielded nothing conclusive. The murder weapon, the mattock found in the attic, bore no fingerprints. The footprints in the snow had long since melted away. The killer, it seemed, had vanished as completely as he had appeared. The villagers grew restless, their fear turning to suspicion. Old grudges resurfaced. Neighbors eyed each other with mistrust, and the sense of community that had once bound Groburn together began to fray. The Gruber farm, now abandoned, became a place of dread, a reminder that evil could strike anywhere, and that justice was not guaranteed. Months passed, then years. The files on Hinterkaifeck grew thick with statements, reports, and dead ends. The police, their initial zeal dulled by frustration, moved on to other cases. The villagers, too, tried to forget, though the memory of the murders lingered in every whispered conversation, every creak of the attic floorboards at night. No one was ever charged. No one confessed. The killer's identity remained a mystery, a shadow lurking at the edge of memory. And so, Hinterkaifeck became more than just a crime. It became a legend, a cautionary tale, a riddle that would haunt Germany for generations. The unanswered questions echoed through the years. Who had moved silently through the snow that night? Who had waited in the attic, watching the family below? Who had killed with such savagery, then lingered to tend the animals and light the fires? The answers, if they existed, were buried with the dead, lost in the silence that followed. And so, the case remained open, a wound that never healed, a reminder that some mysteries are never solved, and that sometimes the darkness wins. In the days and weeks following the grisly discovery at Hinterkaifeck, a dark cloud of fear and speculation settled over the village of Grobern and its surrounding countryside. The brutal murders of the Gruber family had shattered the fragile peace of rural life, but what unsettled the villagers most was not only the violence itself, it was the eerie suggestion that the killer had never truly left. Whispers began to circulate, stories told in hushed tones around kitchen tables and in the dim light of taverns. A stranger had been living in the attic, watching the family, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The notion seemed almost too sinister to believe. Yet, the facts lent a chilling credibility to the rumors. Andreas Gruber had spoken of footsteps in the attic, soft, deliberate sounds heard in the dead of night when the family was gathered below. Keys had gone missing. Doors were found unlocked or ajar in the mornings. Footprints in the snow led to the house but never away. These were not the signs of a random intruder or a passing thief. They suggested a presence, a hidden watcher who had slipped unnoticed into the very heart of the Grubers' home. Neighbors recalled strange occurrences in the days before the murders. Some claimed to have seen a pale figure moving between the trees near the farm, vanishing when approached. Others reported hearing muffled voices or the creak of floorboards in the stillness of night. The children had grown restless, their laughter replaced by nervous silence. The previous maid had fled, terrified by the unseen presence she believed haunted the house. As the investigation unfolded, these rumors took on a life of their own. Villagers speculated about the identity of the stranger. Was he a disgruntled former worker, a rejected lover, a vagrant hiding from the law? Some whispered of darker possibilities, a madman who had taken refuge in the attic, feeding on the family's fear, growing bolder with each passing day. Others suggested a supernatural explanation, a restless spirit bound to the farmstead by violence and sorrow. The attic itself became a symbol of dread. Investigators found signs that someone had been living there, scraps of food, makeshift bedding, footprints in the dust. The killer had used the cramped space as a vantage point, watching the family's every move, learning their habits, waiting for the moment when he could strike with deadly precision. The idea that the murderer had shared the house with his victims, unseen and unheard, added a new layer of horror to the crime. The psychological implications were profound. The family's terror was not only of death but of being watched, stalked in their own home by an invisible predator. The killer's presence in the attic was a violation of the most sacred sanctuary, the home itself. It was a slow, insidious form of torture, a game of cat and mouse played out in silence and shadow. This theory also complicated the investigation. If the killer had lived among the family, he would have known their routines, their weaknesses, their secrets. He could have manipulated them, isolated them, and struck when they least expected it. The absence of forced entry, the untouched valuables, the calm after the murders, all pointed to a perpetrator intimately familiar with the household. Yet, despite the mounting suspicion and the exhaustive questioning of dozens of people, no one was ever charged. The stranger in the attic remained a ghost, an unseen presence whose identity was lost to time. The attic, once a place of quiet storage and forgotten memories, became a silent witness to evil, its shadows harboring secrets that would never be fully uncovered. In the years that followed, the story of the stranger in the attic became part of local legend. Children grew up hearing warnings about the dangers lurking in the dark corners of the house. Adults spoke of Hinterkaifeck in tones of fear and fascination, a place where the boundary between safety and terror had been irrevocably broken. The mystery of the attic, the hidden watcher, the silent predator, remains one of the most haunting aspects of the Hinterkaifeck murders. It is a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are those who live among us, unseen and unknown, waiting patiently for their moment to strike. The murders at Hinterkaifeck left a wound not just in the Gruber family, but in the psyche of the entire region. As the weeks turned into months and the investigation failed to yield the suspect, the vacuum of certainty was quickly filled by rumor, speculation, and fear. The farmstead, once merely a symbol of rural isolation, became a canvas for the community's darkest imaginings. Theories multiplied, each more chilling than the last, each a reflection of the anxieties and secrets that festered beneath the surface of village life. The shadow of a personal vendetta. For many, the savagery of the killings pointed to a crime of passion or revenge. Andreas Gruber was not a beloved man. He was known for his harshness, his stubborn pride, and the iron grip he kept on his family. Old disputes with neighbors over land and livestock had simmered for years. There were stories of arguments that had ended in threats, of grudges that spanned generations. Some whispered that a rival farmer, pushed to the brink by Andreas's intransigence, had finally snapped. Others pointed to former workers, men dismissed without pay or insulted in front of others, who might have nursed their resentment in silence. The brutality of the murders, the repeated blows, the care taken to cover the bodies, the killer's eerie calm in remaining on the property, suggested a familiarity with the victims, a hatred that had festered and finally erupted. Yet, when police questioned those with the strongest motives, alibis were offered, and no evidence could be found. The vendetta theory, so plausible in its emotional logic, dissolved under the cold scrutiny of fact. Family secrets and forbidden ties. The Gruber family's isolation was not merely geographic. Behind closed doors, their relationships were fraught with tension and rumor. The village had long whispered about the nature of Andreas's relationship with his daughter, Victoria. Court records revealed that he had been convicted of incest years earlier, though both he and Victoria denied the charges. The paternity of little Joseph was a matter of constant speculation. Was he Andreas's son, or the result of an affair with a neighbor, perhaps even Lorenz Schlittenbauer himself? Some believed that the murders were the violent culmination of these secrets. Perhaps Victoria, desperate to escape her father's control, had confided in someone who took it upon themselves to mete out justice. Or perhaps the killer was a rejected lover, driven to madness by jealousy and betrayal. The wounds on Victoria, more numerous and violent than those on the others, seemed to hint at a personal connection, a rage directed specifically at her. Yet, as with the vendetta theory, the investigation found no proof. Those closest to the family were questioned, their alibis tested and retested. No confession was ever extracted, no evidence ever surfaced. The secrets of the Gruber family remained just that, secrets, tantalizing and unresolved. The specter of a deranged outsider. As the more personal theories failed to yield answers, attention turned outward. The idea of a stranger, a madman, a vagrant, a criminal passing through, took hold. The footprints in the snow, the missing keys, the eerie sense that someone had been living in the attic all suggested an intruder who had infiltrated the family's life, watched them from the shadows, and struck when the moment was right. This theory was in some ways the most terrifying. The notion that the killer was not known to the family, not bound by the logic of revenge or passion, but was instead a force of pure chaos, a predator who struck without warning or reason. The villagers began to see strangers with suspicion. Every unfamiliar face became a potential murderer. The countryside, once a place of safety, now seemed filled with hidden dangers. Police scoured the region for drifters and ex-soldiers, men broken by the war and left to wander the roads. They checked asylums for escapees, questioned travelers at train stations, and compared the details of the Hinterkaifeck murders to unsolved crimes in other towns. Yet, as before, no suspect emerged. The killer had vanished as completely as he had appeared, leaving only fear and unanswered questions in his wake. The toll of uncertainty. As these theories swirled, the villagers of Groburn and the investigators themselves became trapped in a labyrinth of doubt. Each explanation was plausible, each had its champions and detractors, but none could be proven. The farmstead stood empty, its windows dark, its secrets locked behind doors that no one dared open. The case files grew thicker, filled with statements, rumors, and dead ends. In time, the theories themselves became part of the legend of Hinterkaifeck, a story told and retold, each version shaped by the teller's fears and suspicions. The truth, if it existed, was buried with the dead, lost in the silence that followed the last, echoing blow. And so, the mystery endured. Was it a neighbor's revenge, a family's shame, or the random cruelty of a stranger? No one could say. Theories would continue to multiply, each a reflection of the darkness that had descended on Hinterkaifeck, a darkness that would never fully lift. The horror of the Hinterkaifeck murders did not end with the slaughter of 6 innocents. In the days that followed, the farmstead became the stage for a new, quieter terror, one defined not by violence, but by the eerie normalcy that settled over the property. Smoke continued to rise from the chimney. The animals were fed and milked. The dog barked at strangers, as if nothing had changed. To the outside world, Hinterkaifeck appeared to carry on, its routines undisturbed. But inside, the killer moved among the dead, maintaining the illusion of life with a composure that would haunt investigators and villagers alike for generations. What kind of person could linger in such a place? What mind could tend livestock, light fires, and eat meals in the kitchen while the bodies of his victims lay cold and silent just meters away? The answer, if there was one, lay not in the evidence left behind, but in the psychological abyss that the killer had revealed by his actions. Unlike the frenzied violence of a crime of passion, or the hurried escape of a thief, the murderer at Hinterkaifeck displayed a patience and self-control that was almost inhuman. He did not flee into the night, nor did he ransack the house for valuables. Instead, he moved through the rooms with the calm of someone who belonged there, someone who had either planned every detail or who found a strange comfort in the aftermath of his own brutality. The villagers, when they learned of this, were horrified. It was one thing to imagine a killer driven by rage or desperation. It was another to confront the reality of a predator who could remain so composed, so methodical, in the presence of his victims. The killer's actions in the days after the murders became the subject of endless speculation. Some believed he had slept in the family's beds, eaten their food, even worn their clothes. Others whispered that he had spent hours in the attic, watching the world outside through cracks in the walls, waiting for the right moment to vanish. The police, too, were unsettled by what they found. The barn and house showed signs of recent activity, fires freshly lit, animals well cared for, food missing from the pantry. Yet the bodies remained undisturbed, hidden beneath hay or tucked beneath blankets, as if the killer could not bear to look at what he had done, but could not bring himself to leave, either. This chilling composure suggested a mind at once deeply disturbed and terrifyingly rational, a killer who was not only unafraid of discovery, but who seemed to revel in his own control over the scene. The psychological profile that emerged was unlike anything the investigators had encountered. The killer's calmness spoke of a profound detachment, an ability to compartmentalize horror and routine, violence and normalcy. It was as if, in the aftermath of the murders, he had become the master of Hinterkaifeck, inhabiting the roles of both caretaker and destroyer. The farmstead, once the domain of the Gruber family, was now his kingdom, a place where he could play out his fantasies of dominance and control, unchallenged and unseen. This composure also complicated the investigation. The killer's careful maintenance of the property masked the true timeline of the murders, making it difficult to determine when the family had died and when the killer had finally departed. The neighbors, seeing smoke from the chimney and hearing the animals tended, assumed all was well. The killer's calmness bought him time to erase traces, time to plan his escape, time to savor his victory. In the years that followed, this aspect of the case became one of its most haunting mysteries. The idea that the murderer could remain so unruffled, so methodical, in the aftermath of such savagery, unsettled even the most hardened investigators. It suggested a level of calculation and self-possession that bordered on the monstrous, a mind capable of both extreme violence and chilling normalcy. The villagers, for their part, never forgot. The story of the killer who stayed became a cautionary tale, A reminder that evil does not always announce itself with frenzy or chaos. Sometimes it moves quietly, tending fires and feeding animals, wearing the mask of ordinary life while hiding unimaginable darkness beneath the surface. And so, the legend of Hinterkaifeck endured, not just as a story of murder, but as a study in the psychology of evil. The killer's calmness, his chilling composure, became a symbol of the unknown, a shadow that lingered long after the blood had dried and the farmstead had fallen silent. It was a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not always those who strike and flee, but those who remain, unhurried and unafraid, in the ruins they have made. The murders at Hinterkaifeck did not remain a local tragedy for long. In the days following the discovery of the bodies, word spread rapidly through Grobern and the neighboring villages. By the end of the week, the story had leapt from rural Bavaria to the pages of Munich's newspapers, and from there, it swept across Germany like a chill wind. The gruesome details, the slaughter of an entire family, the killer's eerie composure, the untouched valuables, were repeated and embellished at every turn, transforming Hinterkaifeck from a lonely farmstead into a symbol of dread and mystery for an entire nation. The press descends. Reporters arrive by the dozen, their notepads ready, their eyes hungry for horror. They descended on the muddy lanes of Grobern, crowding the village tavern, pestering the police, and peering through the gates of the now infamous farm. Their stories, printed in bold headlines, were a blend of fact and rumor, speculation and sensation. "Murder farm in Bavaria," cried one paper. "Family slain by unknown hand, killer still at large," screamed another. The public devoured every detail, the missing keys, the footprints in the snow, the bodies hidden beneath hay, the child's hair torn out in agony. The press painted Hinterkaifeck as a place of evil, a house where the boundaries between the living and the dead, the ordinary and the monstrous, had been fatally blurred. Journalists interviewed anyone who would speak, neighbors, school teachers, even the priest. Each offered their own theory, their own fragment of the story, until the truth was lost in a fog of speculation. A nation gripped by fear. As the story spread, so too did the fear. In cities and towns far from Bavaria, people locked their doors and peered nervously into the shadows. The idea that a killer could live among his victims, unseen and undetected, struck at the heart of every household. Parents warned their children not to stray from home. Farmers, once proud of their isolation, began to see their solitude as a threat. The countryside, long romanticized as a place of peace and safety, was recast as a landscape of hidden dangers. Rumors multiplied with each retelling. Some claimed the killer was a madman, a veteran broken by the war, wandering the roads in search of vengeance. Others whispered of a supernatural curse, a darkness that had settled over Hinterkaifeck and would not be lifted until the truth was found. Letters poured into the police from all over Germany, tips, confessions, accusations, and pleas for protection. The authorities, overwhelmed and under pressure, struggled to separate fact from fiction, theories and speculation. The national conversation turned to theories. Newspapers published diagrams of the farm, timelines of the murders, and interviews with criminal experts. Was it a crime of passion, a vendetta, or the work of a deranged outsider? Was the killer still hiding in the woods, or had he vanished into the anonymity of the city? Every detail became a clue, every rumor a possible solution. Some saw in the case a reflection of post-war Germany's anxieties. The country was still reeling from the trauma of the First World War, its economy shattered, its people displaced, its faith in order and security deeply shaken. The Hinterkaifeck murders seemed to embody the chaos lurking beneath the surface of everyday life. If such horror could happen in a quiet Bavarian village, what safety was there anywhere? The farm as a morbid pilgrimage. Hinterkaifeck itself became a site of morbid pilgrimage. Strangers arrived by train and carriage, trudging up the muddy lane to stare at the shuttered house and barn. Some came out of genuine curiosity, others in search of souvenirs or a brush with the macabre. The villagers, already traumatized, grew resentful of the constant intrusion, but they could not stop the tide of visitors. The farm became a symbol, a place where the ordinary had been shattered, where evil had walked in daylight. The lasting impact. The case's notoriety was not limited to the press. It seeped into popular culture, songs, poems, and even plays were written about the murders. Children dared each other to walk past the farm at night. Housewives whispered about the stranger in the attic, the killer who might still be at large. The name Hinterkaifeck became shorthand for any unsolved crime, any unexplained tragedy. For the police and the authorities, the pressure was immense. Every lead was pursued, every suspect questioned, but the case remained stubbornly unsolved. The inability to bring the killer to justice became a national shame, a symbol of the limits of law and order in a world that seemed increasingly unpredictable. The legacy of fear. As months turned to years, the story of Hinterkaifeck faded from the headlines, but it never disappeared. It lingered in the collective memory of Germany, a cautionary tale, a riddle without an answer, a reminder that even the safest places can harbor unimaginable darkness. The farm itself was eventually demolished, its fields plowed under, but the legend endured. For generations, the case would be invoked whenever fear and uncertainty gripped the nation. It became a touchstone for discussions of crime, justice, and the unknown. The unanswered questions: who was the killer? Why did he stay? What secrets did the Gruber family hide? Continued to haunt those who remembered. In the end, Hinterkaifeck was more than a crime. It was a mirror, reflecting the fears and anxieties of a nation in turmoil. Its legacy was not just the tragedy of a single family, but the way it revealed the fragility of safety, the persistence of evil, and the enduring power of mystery. The years after the Hinterkaifeck murders unfolded like a slow, gray fog over the Bavarian countryside. At first, the shock was raw and immediate, a wound that would not close, a story whispered in every kitchen and tavern from Grobern to Munich. But as months turned to years and years to decades, the horror did not fade. Instead, it became part of the landscape, a shadow that stretched across generations, haunting the region with unanswered questions and a sense of unease that no passage of time could dispel. The farmstead falls silent. After the investigation ended in frustration, the Hinterkaifeck farmstead stood empty, its windows dark and its doors locked tight. The fields grew wild, weeds choking the once orderly rows. The barn, where the bodies had been found, sagged under the weight of neglect. Local children dared one another to approach the house after dark, but few had the courage to cross its threshold. Those who did spoke of cold drafts, strange noises, and a feeling of being watched, echoes, perhaps, of the terror that had unfolded within those walls. Eventually, the farm was razed, the land plowed under in a futile attempt to erase the memory of what had happened there. But the story could not be buried so easily. The name Hinterkaifeck became a byword for dread, a tale told around fires on winter nights, a warning to those who believed themselves safe in their own homes. The investigation grows cold. The police files on Hinterkaifeck grew thick with statements, rumors, and dead ends. Every few years, a new investigator would take up the case, convinced that a fresh perspective or a new forensic technique might finally reveal the truth. They pored over old photographs, re-interviewed aging witnesses, and compared the details of the murders to other unsolved crimes. But the trail was always cold. The killer had vanished as completely as if he had never existed, leaving behind only the silence of the dead and the confusion of the living. Theories continued to swirl, some plausible, others fantastical. Was it a neighbor, driven by jealousy or revenge? A family member, desperate to escape a web of secrets and shame? Or was it, as some believed, a stranger who had slipped into the house, watched from the attic, and then disappeared into the night? Each theory had its champions and its detractors, but none could be proven. The facts were too few, the evidence too compromised, the passage of time too relentless. The haunting of a community. For the people of Grobern and the surrounding villages, the murders at Hinterkaifeck became more than just a crime. They became a kind of curse, a reminder that evil could strike anywhere, at any time. Parents warned their children not to stray too far from home. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, old grudges resurfacing in the absence of closure. The sense of community that had once bound the region together was frayed, replaced by a lingering weariness that never quite disappeared. Stories of the murders were passed down from one generation to the next, growing in the telling. Some spoke of ghostly lights seen in the fields at night, or of strange figures glimpsed at the edge of the woods. Others claimed to hear footsteps in the attic of their own homes, or to feel a cold hand on their shoulder when they were alone. Whether these tales were the product of imagination or something darker, they kept the memory of Hinterkaifeck alive, a scar that refused to heal. The enduring mystery. As decades passed, the case of Hinterkaifeck became a subject of fascination for historians, criminologists, and true crime enthusiasts. Books were written, documentaries filmed, podcasts recorded. Each new generation approached the mystery with fresh eyes, convinced that the answer must be out there, waiting to be discovered. Yet, with every new theory, the essential facts remained unchanged. 6 lives brutally ended, a killer who vanished without a trace, and a community forever marked by the violence that had erupted in its midst. The unsolved nature of the case gave it a peculiar power. Unlike other crimes, where justice, however imperfect, was eventually solved, Hinterkaifeck remained open, unfinished, a question mark that hovered over the region. The lack of closure became its own kind of torment, a puzzle that could never be solved, a story that could never be ended. The legacy of Hinterkaifeck. Today, the fields where the farm once stood are quiet, the land reclaimed by nature and time. But the story of Hinterkaifeck endures, woven into the fabric of the region's identity. It is a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of ordinary life, of the secrets that families and communities keep, and of the mysteries that may never be explained. In the end, the haunting of Hinterkaifeck is not just about the murders themselves, but about the questions they left behind. Who was the killer? What drove him to such savagery? And why, after all these years, does the story still hold us in its grip? Perhaps it is because, in the unsolved mystery of Hinterkaifeck, we see reflected our own fears, the fear of the unknown, the fear of evil without reason, the fear that some questions will never have answers. And so, the farmstead may be gone, but its shadow remains, haunting the region, the country, in the imagination of all who hear its tale. The name Hinterkaifeck no longer belongs merely to a place. It has transcended its physical boundaries to become something more profound, a symbol of dread that resonates through time, a dark legend that refuses to fade, a wound in the collective memory that will not heal. Though the farmstead itself has long since vanished, its foundations plowed under and reclaimed by the Bavarian countryside, the shadow it casts stretches far beyond the fields where it once stood. In the centuries since the murders, Hinterkaifeck has become a cipher for the unknowable, a reminder that some mysteries resist all attempts at resolution. The farm's name is spoken with a particular cadence in the villages around Groburn, a slight hesitation, a lowering of the voice, as if the mere mention might summon something best left undisturbed. Parents still warn children not to wander too far into the woods. Old-timers crossed themselves when passing the spot where the farm once stood. The dread has become part of the landscape, as real and enduring as the hills and forests. What gives Hinterkaifeck its lasting power is not merely the brutality of the crimes, though they were savage beyond imagining. It is not just the eerie composure of the killer, though his calm in the aftermath was chilling. It is not even the failure to bring anyone to justice, though that failure haunts the case like a ghost. No, what makes Hinterkaifeck endure is the way it embodies our deepest fears, the terror of the stranger in the attic, the vulnerability of our most private spaces, the fragility of safety, and the knowledge that evil can walk among us, unseen and unknown. The case has inspired countless books, films, and documentaries. Criminologists still study it, debating theories and examining the scant evidence that remains. Amateur sleuths pore over old newspaper accounts, searching for the one overlooked detail that might finally unlock the mystery. Each generation discovers Hinterkaifeck anew, finding in its unsolved questions a reflection of their own anxieties and fascinations. Yet for all the attention, for all the theories and speculations, the essential truth of what happened at Hinterkaifeck remains elusive. The killer's identity, his motives, the exact sequence of events on that terrible night. All are lost to time, buried with the dead. The files gather dust in archives, the photographs yellow with age, the witnesses have long since passed away. What remains is the story, told and retold, each version shaped by the teller's own fears and interpretations. In this way, Hinterkaifeck has become more than a crime. It is a parable, a cautionary tale about the limits of knowledge and the persistence of mystery. It reminds us that not all questions have answers, that some secrets are never revealed, that the darkness at the edge of the woods sometimes creeps closer, no matter how brightly we light our homes. For the people of Bavaria, Hinterkaifeck remains a wound in the landscape, a place where the veil between the ordinary and the monstrous was torn open. The farm is gone, its buildings demolished, its fields reclaimed, but the memory lingers. On quiet nights, when the wind moves through the trees and shadows gather at the edges of vision, it is easy to imagine that something still watches from the darkness, patient and unseeing. And so, Hinterkaifeck stands as a symbol of dread, its secrets buried with the dead. It is a reminder that some mysteries are never solved, some questions never answered, some darkness never fully dispelled. The story endures not despite its unresolved nature, but because of it, a testament to the enduring power of the unknown to grip our imagination and haunt our dreams. In the end, perhaps that is Hinterkaifeck's true legacy, not the horror of what happened there, but the way it forces us to confront the limits of our understanding, the fragility of our safety, and the knowledge that some shadows never fully recede, no matter how brightly the sun may shine.